You think Hollywood pushes boundaries? Europe has been blowing up the rulebook since the first projector flickered to life. Some movies didn't just rattle audiences, they made entire governments panic. Bans, riots, court cases, even burned film reels. These aren't urban legends, they're real. What film could be so dangerous it was smuggled across borders in secret, or so outrageous it landed its director in court? Get ready, because what you're about to hear will make you rethink what too far really means. Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Some movies get called disturbing. Salo laughs at the word disturbing. Pier Paolo Pasolini's last film is notorious for one simple reason. Almost nobody gets through it without looking away. Inspired by a 200-year-old novel, Pasolini transformed a story of aristocratic depravity into a gut punch that left audiences reeling. Imagine this: a group of elite sadists rounding up teenagers in fascist Italy and turning a remote mansion into a living nightmare. That's not just a plot, that's the blueprint for one of the most banned films ever made. Screenings sparked protests, police raids, and lawsuits. In Italy, censors sliced out entire reels and still couldn't stomach it. France and the UK banned it outright. Australia said, "No way." The US, only art theaters dared to show it, usually with warnings that sounded more like dares. What made Salo radioactive wasn't just its violence or the horrors inflicted on screen, it was the cold, unblinking way Pasolini filmed everything. There's no music to soften the impact, no good guys to root for, just a grim procession of cruelty and humiliation that makes most horror movies look tame. For decades, governments treated Salo like a virus. Critics called it depraved and unwatchable, yet others hailed it as essential art. Today, it sits on almost every list of the most disturbing movies ever made. Love it or hate it, nobody leaves Salo unchanged. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. When Stanley Kubrick adapted Anthony Burgess's novel, he didn't just make a film, he started a culture war. A Clockwork Orange, Storm is all about violence, chaos, and mind games. The visuals were wild, the dialogue was slang-heavy, and the soundtrack blared classical music over scenes nobody could forget. The movie's release turned London into ground zero for outrage. Newspapers screamed that it was corrupting youth, inspiring copycat attacks, and ruining morals. Politicians demanded bans. Even Kubrick's own family started getting threats. The film was banned in several countries, but the real shocker? Kubrick himself asked for it to be pulled from UK theaters. He didn't want any more violence linked to his name, and the studio agreed. For nearly 30 years, British audiences couldn't legally see A Clockwork Orange. Importing or screening it could land you in trouble. The film became legend, a forbidden fruit for a generation raised on rumors and whispered stories about its content. In Europe, bans and censorship were everywhere. Ireland said no. Sweden cut entire scenes. Italy freaked out. The controversy only grew as home video took off and bootleg tapes circulated. When the ban was finally lifted in the UK in 2000, younger viewers found it less shocking, but nobody could deny the power. It's the rare film that changed not just what was allowed on screen, but how society talks about movies themselves. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Some films don't just cross the line, they drag the line so far, nobody can find it again. Cannibal Holocaust is that kind of movie. Director Ruggero Deodato set out to make the ultimate jungle horror film and wound up with one of the most infamous bans in cinema history. It's a fake documentary about an American film crew disappearing in the Amazon, and what gets found is a collection of footage so raw and convincing, people actually thought it was real. Here's how wild things got. After its premiere in Milan, Italian authorities arrested Deodato for suspected murder. The court demanded he prove the actors were still alive. He did, and the charges were dropped, but that didn't slow down the avalanche of bans. The UK's infamous Video Nasties list. Cannibal Holocaust was at the top. Australia banned it too. Norway, Germany, and several other countries followed suit. Even now, it's illegal or heavily censored in many places. What made it so shocking? The violence felt real. The filmmaking style was raw and unpolished, making everything look like genuine news footage. Some scenes were staged with a level of detail that fooled audiences and censors alike. Critics called it a new low, while horror fans passed around bootleg copies, daring each other to sit through the whole thing. 4 decades later, Cannibal Holocaust still holds its reputation. It's either a horror classic or a line that should never have been crossed, depending on who you ask. Irreversible, 2002. When Irreversible premiered at Cannes, people didn't just walk out. They ran for the exits. Gaspar Noé's film took a simple story of revenge and spun it in reverse, showing the aftermath of violence before revealing the events that led to it. The camera work was dizzying, the soundtrack was punishing, and the performances by Monica Bellucci and Vincent Cassel left audiences shaken. What really shocked viewers wasn't just the filmmaking, it was the raw, relentless brutality. Irreversible pushed the boundaries so hard that entire countries said, enough. Italy and Norway banned or heavily censored it. Even in France, the debate was fierce. Critics were split. Was it groundbreaking art or a step too far? The film became a lightning rod for debate, with some calling it one of the most important French films of the decade, and others demanding it be pulled from theaters entirely. Noé himself didn't seem to care about the controversy. He said he wanted to make a film you couldn't just watch and forget. Mission accomplished. The film's structure, playing out in reverse order, forces you to sit with every consequence before you know what caused it. That's part of what makes it so haunting. Even years later, Irreversible is remembered as a cinematic dare. See it once, and you'll never shake the memory. Baise-moi 2000. Few films have set off a firestorm quite like Baise-moi. Released in 2000, this French crime drama exploded onto screens with a story about two women on a violent rampage after facing brutal injustice. But what happened on screen wasn't the only thing that had everyone talking. The movie's unfiltered style and refusal to play by any rules made it the subject of fierce debate across Europe. French censors reacted by slapping it with a rare X rating, the kind usually reserved for the most extreme content. That decision triggered protests from artists and critics who claimed the film was being unfairly targeted, but other countries weren't so diplomatic. Norway banned it outright. Australia followed suit. Even in France, the controversy dragged on for years, with some theaters refusing to screen it and court battles popping up over whether it should be allowed at all. What set Baise-moi apart was its fearless, anything-goes attitude. It didn't sugarcoat anything. Instead, directors Virginie Despentes and Coralie Trinity delivered a road movie that felt like a punch in the gut. Raw camera work, jumpy editing, and a relentless pace made sure you never felt comfortable for a second. Some called it a feminist rallying cry. Others saw it as pure provocation. Either way, the movie forced people to confront questions about what's acceptable in art and what crosses the line. Love it or hate it, Baise-moi is still one of the most talked about French films of the new century. The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. Here's a movie that set Europe ablaze before it even opened. Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ wasn't just a film, it was an international incident waiting to happen. Adapted from a novel, the movie tackled themes most directors wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. And the backlash, swift, loud, and in some countries, downright dangerous. Protesters lined up outside theaters in France and Italy, waving signs and chanting for bans. Local governments in parts of both countries caved to public pressure, pulling the film from theaters or refusing to license it altogether. The reaction in Greece was even harsher. Lawmakers banned it before the first ticket was sold, and some cinemas that dared to show it anyway faced threats and attacks. The uproar made headlines worldwide. What's wild is that most people debating the film hadn't even seen it. Scorsese wasn't out to offend, he wanted to explore doubt, faith, and temptation. But for many, just the idea was enough. The controversy gave the movie a reputation far beyond its box office. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what was so shocking that entire countries wanted it erased from screens. Over the years, the bans have faded, but the legend has only grown. Even now, it's remembered as the film that proved one thing. In Europe, sometimes just asking the big questions is enough to get your movie blacklisted. In the realm of the senses, 1976. Few films have been smuggled through customs with the same urgency as In the Realm of the Senses. Officially a Japanese production, it was funded and released by a French company, making it one of the most controversial imports Europe has ever seen. The story, based on a real-life case of obsession in 1930s Tokyo, wasn't just boundary-pushing. It ran straight through every line set by European censors. When it premiered in France, the reaction was immediate. Police raided theaters, reels vanished, and government officials scrambled to figure out what to do with a film so explicit, so intense, it left audiences stunned. The movie was banned or heavily censored in France, Germany, and the UK. Customs officials even seized prints at airports, trying to keep them from ever being shown. What set this film apart wasn't just the subject matter, but how director Nagisa Oshima handled it. Raw, hypnotic, and completely unflinching. Every scene dared viewers to look away, and plenty did. In Italy and Spain, authorities tried to block any screening, calling it a threat to public order. Critics argued it was a work of art, not a cheap shocker, but most countries only saw trouble. Despite the bans, In the Realm of the Senses found an audience among cinephiles and underground theaters. Today, it stands as a symbol of how far filmmakers and those who love challenging cinema will go to defend freedom of expression, even when it means going up against the entire system. The Devils, 1971. If ever a film was built to cause panic, Ken Russell's The Devils was it. The ingredients, outrage, spectacle, and a true story about power gone mad. Russell took the tale of a 17th century priest accused of witchcraft and transformed it into a nightmarish vision of paranoia and hysteria that made even the censors flinch. When it hit UK theaters, the reaction was instant and explosive. The British Board of Film Classification demanded massive cuts, and some scenes were lost for decades. But even the trimmed version sent shockwaves through the public. Protests erupted. Politicians blasted the film for undermining moral order. The Vatican issued a condemnation. In France and Italy, entire cities banned it. In Finland and Norway, it vanished from theaters entirely. What rattled everyone so badly? Russell's direction was hallucinatory, flashing between gothic horror and wild surrealism. There were no safe spaces, no comfort zones. The film ripped through sacred cows, authority figures, and every social taboo it could find. The result? A movie that seemed to set fire to the screen itself. Decades later, The Devils is still infamous, partly because you still can't see the full uncut version in most countries. It's a legend of censorship, a reminder that sometimes what's most dangerous about a film isn't the violence or the outrage, but the fearless way it forces people to face their own boundaries. Love Camp 7, 1969. Sometimes a film is so controversial that it's not just banned, it's erased from existence in whole countries. Love Camp 7, a British-Italian production, hit screens in 1969 and immediately found itself on the wrong side of censors all over Europe. The plot: American agents infiltrate a German prison camp during World War II, hoping to rescue prisoners and sabotage the enemy. Sounds like routine war movie stuff until the movie goes off the rails. From the first reel, it's clear this isn't your grandfather's war film. The movie's blend of harsh content and exploitation quickly earned it a reputation as a cinematic powder keg. British censors said no. Ireland banned it. Norway followed suit. Today, the film is still illegal to own or distribute in the UK, making it one of the few movies to remain on the country's banned list for decades. What's wild is that, outside of the controversy, hardly anyone has actually seen it. Bootleg tapes circulate among collectors, but for the most part, Love Camp 7 lives in legend. Critics called it trash. Censors called it dangerous, and historians point to it as the start of a wave of controversial movies that would test the limits of European censorship. More than 50 years later, the film's reputation hasn't faded. It remains a touchstone for anyone who wants to understand just how far European authorities would go to keep certain images out of public view. Pink Flamingos, 1972. If you think moviegoers are hard to shock, you haven't seen what happened when Pink Flamingos landed in Europe. John Waters' underground classic is famous for one thing: gleeful, unapologetic shock value. When Divine and her oddball crew first strutted onto the screen, European censors hit the panic button so fast you'd think the film was a national threat. The UK was quick to ban it, refusing classification and making it illegal to screen or even own in the country for years. Norway, Switzerland, and Australia followed, slamming the door on Waters' parade of bad taste. Authorities didn't just object to the wild characters and out there storylines. They were convinced the movie itself was a kind of social hand grenade. For decades, Pink Flamingos was whispered about in the same breath as forbidden books or dangerous political tracks. What's crazy is how the ban only made the legend bigger. Fans smuggled bootleg VHS tapes across borders, holding secret screenings that felt more like protests than movie nights. Waters, for his part, leaned into the chaos, calling the film an act of art terrorism. Decades later, Pink Flamingos is recognized as a milestone in cult cinema, but it's also a case study in how a movie can scare the establishment for all the wrong or maybe the right reasons. Even today, it's a reminder. Sometimes the most shocking thing about a film is the freedom it demands. Matador, 1986. Long before Pedro Almodovar became a household name, he set off alarms across Europe with Matador. This was no glossy Spanish drama. It was a wild, unpredictable ride through obsession, violence, and the dark side of human nature. When the film debuted, the reaction was swift. Spanish authorities cut scenes, critics argued, and other countries debated whether it was too much for their audiences to handle. Set in the world of retired bullfighters and twisted passions, Matador was the movie that proved Almodovar wasn't interested in playing it safe. Instead, he delivered a film that felt like a fever dream, hallucinatory, intense, and impossible to look away from. Spanish censors demanded edits for its blend of intense imagery and raw themes. In Ireland, the film faced an outright ban. Other countries quietly cut sections or limited screenings to late-night adult audiences. The controversy became part of the movie's DNA. Almodovar, never one to shy from the spotlight, argued the film was about confronting our own fears and instincts. Critics either loved it or called it a provocation too far. What's certain is that Matador forced a conversation about what kind of stories Spain and the rest of Europe were willing to tell on screen. Today, it's seen as an essential chapter in European cinema history, not just for its audacity, but for how it helped launch a director who would go on to challenge and redefine the rules of film around the world. Antichrist, Denmark, 2009. Lars von Trier has never been shy about stirring the pot, but with Antichrist, he practically boiled it over. This Danish psychological horror film showed up at Cannes and immediately split the audience into two camps, those who stormed out and those who couldn't look away. Von Trier's signature style, moody visuals, relentless tension, and disturbing imagery pushed every boundary. The reaction in Europe was wild. French and Spanish censors demanded cuts or slapped on severe age restrictions. Italy's film board briefly banned it outright, while other countries only allowed limited screenings with heavy warnings attached. Critics wrote pages about the film's style, but most of the buzz was about what viewers could barely handle. Many theaters refused to show it, arguing it was just too much for mainstream audiences. What makes Antichrist so unforgettable is the way it dares the viewer to stick it out until the end. The story, about a grieving couple unraveling in a remote cabin, seems simple, but Von Trier's direction turns it into a slow-motion train wreck of dread and chaos. Even hardcore film fans were left reeling. Over a decade later, the movie is still cited as one of Europe's most controversial. Whether you think it's a work of art or a dare gone wrong, there's no denying it. Antichrist is a film that leaves a scar, and that's exactly how Von Trier wanted it. Battle Royale, 2000. Sometimes a film is so ahead of its time, the world has to catch up or run scared. Battle Royale, a Japanese production, lit up Europe with its chilling vision of teenagers forced into a deadly competition on a deserted island. The story is simple. Only one can survive, and the rest, well, you get the idea. But the execution was so intense that European censors saw red. Germany and the UK put the film under a microscope, with calls for outright bans or severe editing. France, already reeling from debates about violence in media, kept the film away from young audiences for years. The timing was brutal. In the wake of real-life tragedies and school violence, Battle Royale was quickly labeled dangerous, too raw, too real, too much. Ironically, the outrage made the film legendary among young viewers, who traded copies and quoted lines in secret. Directors and critics called it a wake-up call for a society hooked on reality TV and competition. Authorities called it a public menace. The result? Years of controversy, followed by grudging respect as the movie's influence spread to Hollywood and beyond. Today, Battle Royale stands as both a warning and a touchstone. A film that didn't just get banned, it changed how Europe thought about youth, media, and just how far a story can go before the world says enough.